Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to my ranking series for Final Fantasy XIV. Right now I've been going through ranking the raids and the trial series, and I've already finished up A Realm Reborn in regards to those two things. So this video, probably the hardest video of all my ranking videos, I'm going to be talking about the Heavensward raid series Alexander. So that's Gordius, Midas, and the Creator. As a precursor to this, I was very conflicted when I was ranking a lot of these fights because my memory of them is probably a lot different than many other people. I was around for the hardcore 16 to 18 hour days of Gordius and Living Liquid and Manipulator, and then I had a more relaxed approach to things like Midas and the Creator. So it was like one of the expansions where I took on both extremes pretty seriously, and so that's probably changed my opinion on some of these encounters, even looking back all these years later, and even revisiting some of them recently with a low item level setup. But either way, the point of this video, I'm going to rank these fights from my least favorite to my most favorite based on a few general criteria and just my personal opinion. So with that, let's relive some trauma, shall we? Now, before we get started, I want to tell you about this video's sponsor, Magic Spoon. You know, I actually used to love cereal as my go-to snack. Pour a bunch of dry cereal in a bowl and just eat it on the side of my desk while I'm doing work or while I'm playing games. Sometimes I would just eat out of the bag too. Sorry, Mom. But several years ago, I just stopped buying cereal altogether because it was full of sugar and a bunch of other things I just didn't want to eat. So when Magic Spoon reached out to me and wanted to sponsor a video, you can bet that I jumped on that one pretty quick. I mean, there's a lot to say about it. It's a high quality cereal with all sorts of accolades on its rap sheet. 140 calories per serving, 13 to 14 grams of protein per serving, 4 grams of net carbs per serving, and for me, the biggest thing is the 0 grams of sugar. Not to mention it's gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and keto-friendly. I've got their variety pack here with 4 great flavors: peanut butter, cocoa, fruity, and frosted. They're all good on their own, but I personally like to get a little crazy and mix the peanut butter and the cocoa. That's really good. I'm recording this at like 9 p.m. and it's been a long day, so this is definitely hitting the spot right now. So if you want to try out Magic Spoon and support the channel, then you can use the QR code that's on the screen right now. You can just scan that with your phone real quick, or you can use the link in the description. If you use discount code Mr. Happy, you will save $5 on any order of Magic Spoon. And it has a money back guarantee, a 100% happiness guarantee from Magic Spoon. If you don't like it, they will send you your money back. So scan the QR code or use the link, and don't forget the discount code Mr. Happy to save $5. With that, let's get to the video. All right, so first one I have here on my list is ranked at the very bottom, my least favorite encounter in all of the Heavensward raid series, A2S. That's the second encounter in Gordius. All right. This is just one of those ruined by doing it weekly fights because very similar to in my A Realm Reborn ranking, this is an ad fight much like turn 4. And so the early weeks were actually quite intense. So the premise of the fight, if you've never done it, you're fighting wave after wave of goblins and different goblin machines, and each of them has their own mechanics and means of counterplaying them. However, the big gimmick of this encounter is that you get 2 gobwalkers to use throughout the fights that a player can step into and then use a few abilities that it has. You can crowd control certain enemies, you can weaken them, and you can also drag bombs away from the party, which is probably the thing you do the most with this. Now, the resource pool is finite as well, and it can only be refilled by leaving a certain type of mob barely alive and then allowing them to reabsorb the energy, and that's very important when it comes to actually managing the resource for them. I believe it was called EP. Either way, in order to deal with every wave, you really needed like a good strategy for both the group fighting the actual goblins as well as the person in the gobwalker. They needed to know what to give vulnerability stacks to, what to stun, when the bombs were supposed to be spawning, and you needed to work in tandem with the actual party. So it's one of those fights that, again, it's really cool when you think about it on the surface. When it's described to you, it actually sounds engaging and fun, but it loses that luster so incredibly quickly, so much so to the point where it just feels like a chore. Being in the gobwalker isn't super fun, even during week 1. As someone who had to do some of the gobwalker duty week 1, we had it split between 2 different people, compared to being in the waves and the the encounters and dealing with all of the different DPS checks and position checks and all that. The Gobwalker was kind of just the free pass to not have to actually learn how to play your job in the encounter. And that takes a lot away from it. But even when I'm not in the Gobwalker, I mean, it just, after a week or two, you just mow through everything so quickly. And then the Gobwalker's job actually starts to look like the one that you want week after week. And it's just, it's unfortunate because I said it in the Realm Reborn raid ranking video. I like when the dev team makes ad-based fights, and I'd like to see them do it again. But I don't think this is the kind I'd ever want again. The Gobwalker as a gimmick just doesn't work for me, and I don't like those very fight-specific gimmicks, especially vehicle gimmicks. They just don't resonate with me personally. So between the sheer tedium and how much the unique aspects of it just dissipate after the first week or two, I think this has to be on the bottom of the list. So that's where it is. Now, A2S I put on the bottom of the list because I genuinely just don't like the encounter and what it's trying to do. The next one, number 11, is A4S, the fourth encounter in Gordius, the Manipulator. And like a part of me, as someone who experienced this firsthand, wants to put it below A2S, but this is like a real boss fight with some real mechanics and a lot of really interesting concepts that just doesn't turn out fun. So I think it just kind of has to naturally be above it. But Gordius as a raid tier, I often credit as the downfall of the Heavensward raid scene, on top of the potential fear that it could have re-killed Final Fantasy XIV. Like, that's how bad I think Gordius was for the overall community. And that might be kind of weird, because I'm sure you guys hear some praise about Heavensward raiding from all of us, you know, Heavensward boomers and, you know, older Realm Reborn boomers. I think 1, 2, and 3 are generally okay. Some of them even great for their time. But A4S is an encounter that absolutely no one misses. In a fight against the Manipulator, players are tasked with fighting this stationary machine by knocking out its 4 legs before dealing with the body itself. On the surface, it exhibits a great deal of creativity. You know, the boss gains new abilities every time you destroy a leg. The order you destroy the legs is also up to you. You just have to commit to one leg. You can't like damage them little by little and then just kill one and then kill them all back to back. As soon as you kill one leg, all the other legs come back at full health. So you just need to commit to which one. And that can change your general position, and given the mechanics that are introduced during certain waves of the legs, like it just makes the fight a little bit more adjustable. And on top of that, you need things like crowd control to deal with the steaming legs in order to reduce the attacks. There's a ton of adds that require careful management. You know, you have to weaken the little dolls and feed them to the big doll and then kill the big doll, and the big doll does huge damage to the tank, but then the tanks are both taking tank busters from the boss itself, so you need ones with cooldowns for the adds and then ones with cooldowns for the bosses. And there's a lot of little things, and I think almost all the mechanics are acceptable and even fun at times. But there's 3 things that really land it down here on my list. First is the boringness of the boss itself. Manipulator is one of the most generic looking robots we could have gotten, and it's just the complete immobility just drags down the energy for the whole fight, especially because there's so much arena on the opposite side of the room. And while that's there to do mechanics, you just like, the boss is just sitting there the whole time while you're doing it. Number 2, the tuning is way too tight. While doable in the lower gear levels, it's kind of like what we do in raids now, actually. It's been beaten in like the bare minimum that you need for it, but it requires absolute perfection from the players in order to beat it at those gear levels. And honestly, it's not super fun. A lot of it's just, there's so much damage that it just makes it harder to survive. It's less even about like damage checks or things. It's just living is sometimes a problem in that regard. And then finally, Nisi. This is a mechanic that strikes fear into the hearts of raiders everywhere. Basically, it's a passable debuff that deals damage over time, and it gradually wears off the longer that you have it, and it'll lose stacks of Nisi starting at 5. Now, as it loses stacks, it actually starts to do less damage, so your natural response would be to let it wear off. But instead, you actually need players with Nisi to disarm a mechanic, Royal Pentacles, in the final phase. So from the point you receive it until the point where you never need to see a pentacle again, it has to be maintained and passed around all the different players safely. If 2 players with different Nisis touch, you're going to die. If you have a bad pass timing, you're going to die, and you need to be able to take these damage amounts between all the other damage that the boss is dealing, between the tanks dealing with tank busts. It's just, there's so many things back to back to back to back to back. And one mistake and it's all over. Now, to be fair, that's how raiding is, but what all of that I just described is then equally as undone by a cheese strategy where you could actually suicide to the pentacles even 2 of them at a time, because the game's like server latency is just so weird that you can take 2 insta kills that require you running across a distance and, you know, not die before taking the second one. And then you just raise and move on. Hell, that big ad that you need to feed the little ads to, people just started letting that thing explode and putting all that damage on the boss instead, even though it exploding brings everyone's MP down to 0. People just said, we don't care. It was just easier to do it that way than it was to actually do the ad. So the fact that it's so tightly balanced that you can barely survive attacks, and at the same time you can completely cheese the things that make it difficult with that low gear, it's just such a weird mishmash of bad balancing and just not very well thought out mechanics, not very well tested mechanics. In fact, A4S is responsible for the way the dev team does things now, which you can criticize whether or not you want. But in Gordius, they released it without ever beating it internally without God mode. Every raid tier after that, they have made sure they can beat without God mode. They have a test team, they do it. And while they don't always nail the fights, the fun, or even the balancing in the case of Abyssos, they are still, it really changed the way the dev team thinks and tests things. So at the very least, I'm grateful for that. But it's down here because it's not a fun fight. Above all else, it's just not fun. All right, and now this next one is actually the last on the list that's kind of just at the bottom because I don't like it. The rest of this list is a lot harder for me. But the next one is A9S. That's the first encounter of the creator against the refurbisher. And it's this giant trash robot that absorbs other robots and trash to rebuild itself and power up. The fight's mostly about picking up these coils and putting them down to resurrect robots, and then you're just going to kill them in a different spot so that the refurbisher can't absorb them. Basically, you're going to drop them in lava so he can't, or acid or whatever it is. You're just trying to destroy the robot so he can't absorb them and rebuild. But as the fight goes on, some waves become unavoidable that he'll be able to actually resurrect them. You get to pick and choose which robots you can feed them, and which robots you feed does change the way that the boss gets stronger in some way. So either way, it's just unavoidable. The robot will rebuild itself eventually, and then, you're going to enrage and you're going to die. Honestly, it's not that bad overall. It's serviceable, but the stationary boss again, and honestly, just kind of the repetitive and uninteresting nature of most of the phases and mechanics, it just kind of doesn't impress more than anything else. Acceptable, but not really anything all that special. Also, the actual electrical coils you have to interact with, you have to walk up to them. There's a cast bar for picking them up. If you get hit with them over your head, they get put down, and then you have to drop them in the right spot. But if you drop them while you're moving, they get kind of dropped behind you because of server lane. The interactables, it's not a great idea. So these are the reasons why it's below everything else other than 2 and 4 on the list. Okay, and now into bosses I all actually like, and I kind of just have to rank them based on the overall quality and mechanics. So the next one on the list is A1S, and I'm kind of sad I have to put this down on the list. The Oppressor is kind of like a revisit of Caduceus from back in the first coil. You start off against one boss, and it shows you all the mechanics, and you learn them, and then a second one shows up, and you kind of have to split the party and deal with them both simultaneously. All the mechanics get doubled, including ads, placed AoEs, tank busters, raid wides, everything. The base mechanics are really simple, but also really satisfying for a first turn encounter, and despite being obliterated by gear, it never really becomes unfun or tedious, which is a really important thing for an encounter you're going to do week after week. I think if a fight like this was released today, it would actually be decently received. It probably wouldn't be as important or as popular as some other encounters, but I think it'd be okay. And I think people would really like the odd-shaped arena here. It is just a rectangle, but the size of it is very important to the way all the mechanics play out, and I think people always take a little bit extra note of that. It also comes with its very own door boss in the form of Faust. Now, this is something I didn't mention for A9S as well, but all of the first encounters in Gordius, Midas, and Creator all have a mini Faust boss, and they get a little bit more complex. This one's the simplest. It's literally just a boss that gets stronger and stronger as it summons more ads and does tank busters, and I think maybe it did AoEs. I think it honestly just did tank busters over and over again. And so you just have to, zerg it down while you tank all the ads before it gets too strong. No big deal. Whereas the other ones have like a couple more mechanics, or like raid-wide AoEs, or things that need to be silenced. Like there's a few other things with the other ones, but the Faust, however, is the only notorious one, because there were groups that couldn't get past Faust and had to disband. And I don't mean groups like pickup groups. I mean like statics that played in Coil together and cleared it and couldn't get past Faust in the first couple of weeks and disbanded. Honestly, the only real negatives I have for this is that, gear kind of outscales it because it's a first encounter, which isn't a big knock. And re-killing Faust when you re-enter every single time, it's just not super interesting. It's never interesting to have to re-kill a door boss when you're progging the actual boss. But here it's like, oh, thanks for spending 2 or 3 minutes of my time. At least it was only 2 or 3 minutes of your time as long as you beat it in one pull. But otherwise, I think it's a pretty neat fight. Now, number 7 on the list is going to be A10S. That's the second encounter in the creator. And honestly, I just love this fight for the boss name alone. Lame Bricks Strike Box. Yeah, try saying that 3 times fast. This is an ultra tenacious goblin. He actually shows up in Eureka later, and different versions of him show up in a few other places as well. But he's honestly a pretty cool guy, and I'm glad they brought him back because this fight is a really well done fight. There are 3 buttons on the arena that can be activated by the player or by the boss. Now, the boss will jump on them deliberately, but you can also drag the boss over them, and that will cause them to activate as well. But you're supposed to actually use these buttons to counter the boss mechanics, or the boss uses them against you, and you need to dodge what the buttons are doing. So there's this really neat arena interaction that, combined with the other mechanics, is something I can't even recall the last time we've seen anything like this. It might have been on Lame Bricks. So you have like machines that are like poking and prodding to like separate players across the arena. You of course have stacks, you have spreads, you have point blanks, you have donuts, you have kiting, you have ads. You have all these really creative and engaging encounter bits, and they all come together to make a really, honestly, it's a fight that repeats mechanics, but it always feels like something new is happening. It's a really, really good thing to have. And, it's also nicer interacting with the buttons on the ground than it was picking up the coils or using the Gobwalker or anything like that. It just means that there's the occasional meme activations. But honestly, this one's only down here because I like the other ones more. Again, a lot of them left on the list. I like them for their own individual reasons. And so it just becomes my fun factor, I suppose, that separates them. And the fact that this one's all the way down at 7 and I have that much good to say about it says a lot about the encounters coming up. Number 6 on the list is A5S, the last of the first encounters. This one did come with another Faust. You beat a Faust and then actually 2 more come down with a proximity AoE, and then you got to deal with them, and it's like another 2.5, 3 minute fight. But it also happens to be another fight where I love the name of the boss, Rat Thinks Twinkle Dinks. Yes, again, say that 3 times fast. This guy's like a mad scientist, so the fight's all about battling his experiments and then taking his potions to transform and counter his mechanics. Being the first fight in a raid tier, the use of each potion is pretty straightforward, so it's not like a really cryptic fight. But in order to activate them, there's a player that has to take damage over time, so I do like those kind of interactions with the arena. They don't feel overly tedious. They don't require you to interact with anything in terms of clicking it. You just get to physically be in a location and force other things to happen. And that's when these mechanics are done a lot better. It's a fight with a ton of movement and really simple mechanics that are strung together into something engaging and fun. The boss itself also transforms into this hulked out bugbear goblin that takes reduced damage and deals massive damage to both the tanks and the party. Seriously, this fight has great variety and freshness. It makes stuff like, like P6S. It's just really sad to see this type of encounter and then to see stuff like P6S. It's honestly depressing to see. Not to mention, one of the few places where the ranged LB is used very regularly. Yeah, ranged LB, yeah, that's definitely, I think caster LB maybe was also popular, but I remember ranged LB in this fight. Next up on the list is the very next encounter in Midas, in that of A6S. This encounter sees you face 4 individual mini-bosses in a back-to-back-to-back-to-back gauntlet. Now, in normal mode, if you wipe on any of these bosses, you actually just can go right back to that boss and try again from that point. But in Savage, it's one continuous gauntlet, and from the moment you pull the first robot, the enrage timer begins, which means the time in between the robots is contributing to the enrage time. So it's not something you can be slow and take your time with, despite having all these extra arenas that you have to run through, which keeps it really, really fast paced. And also, because each of the 4 bosses is only like a couple of minutes long, each fight is paced incredibly fast, hopping from mechanic to mechanic really quickly. Blaster is the first boss, and he likes to make clones of himself that the players have to like bait and dodge, or they get tethered to them and they have to either look at them or look away from them. Nothing too crazy or complicated, but requires particular positioning as well as making sure you're paying attention to the bot you're actually attached to. There's also mines on the ground that a tank has to go and manually manually detonate. These are actually a huge problem for a lot of new statics, so much so they actually nerfed this mechanic a month later in order to help more groups get through this initial blaster prog. Not to mention, that's the first place we really had mines like that, and we see those all over the game nowadays. So you really have blaster to, I guess, thank for that mechanic if you want to thank a boss for doing something that kills you. Then you have the second boss, which is actually going to be, what's its name again? I have it written down here, Brawler. Everyone always said Brawler should have been called Blaster, but Brawler's whole mechanic is that he transforms his fists into different weapons. That's the reason why he's called Brawler. So he can turn them into cannons or drills, and they can be distance-based mechanics or tank busters or split damage AoEs. I just need to pay attention to his animations to determine what he's going to do as soon as he's free. Then he has this whole phase where he summons like lightning chakrams, like spinning around the arena, and then there's like orbs that you have to kill and crowd control. Some of them just blow up on the raid, some of them are DPS checks, and on top of that, he's doing the single drill, the single laser, the double drill. Really awesome 2-minute, like 2.5-minute phase. Then you have the third one, Swindler, who has the infamous height mechanic. We were all shocked it wasn't in the Epic of Alexander, the patch 5.1 Ultimate, but it is by far the thing Swindler is known most for. He also has a bunch of ads that show up that, you know, you have to kill. I think they like damage resist each other, but most people just like LB3 them and kind of burn through that. He also has enumerations, which is you need a certain number of people in an AoE. We see that used all the time nowadays, but that was really the first place we saw it way back when. And finally, Vortexer, who is a bit of a meme in and of itself. Now, the fight was actually tough against Vortexer. He's got elemental missiles where he has like water tornadoes that players have to kind of spawn while also dealing split damage with each other, and then the debuffs pass. There's also a lightning debuff that you need to share with at least one other person, but if you share with any more than one person, it kills them. So you have this like 2-player stack, and you have this like 6-player stack over on the other sides, but if you got hit with water, you can't be in the water stack again. There's all these like little rules to it. But then he also has, you know, fire missiles, which can destroy the water tornadoes, and then ice missiles, which can freeze the water tornado. So all of his attacks are like different elements and stuff, even as a wind knockback and all that. And it's really engaging, but it was also a pretty buggy fight. In the first few weeks, I believe, there was a situation where the water debuff and the lightning debuff wouldn't pass to another player, and that's considered a fail and an instant wipe. So it's really, this fight is responsible for a lot of memes. It's responsible for the memes of there were no bugs in Midas. That's, you know, sarcastic. And also, we were told this raid tier would be between second and final coil in difficulty, and this fight showed us that that was an absolute lie. It was not that. We have never trusted difficulty statements since. But either way, it is an awesome fight, even to this day, even post-nerf, and also acts as a teaching tool for A8S, which will use a lot of these mechanics later in the list. And for number 5 on the list, we're going to go up right through Midas one more time into A7S. This fight is against the actual kind of true antagonist of the Alexander Raid series, Quick Thinks All Thoughts. He pilots his own personal Gobwalker, and his is way better than ours was on A2S. And this fight's all about the arena. There's spikes that prevent you from using a lot of space most of the time. There's bombs that need to be spread out carefully, but iconically, he uses these prisons that he traps players in. The boss will pick up or drag tethered players into different prisons, and the goal is to make sure that the right players get put in the right prisons. You need to make sure, let's see if I remember this correctly, the healers go into the poison gas one, the tanks go into the ice one to kill a very hard-hitting ad, the casters go into the slime one, the fire one, but they have to wait until the party destroys a lock on the outside or they just take damage constantly. But the slime takes reduced physical damage, so it has to be a caster or somebody with really, really good magic damage. And then the last one is an alarm ad, which just has a tight DPS check, so we usually sent melees into that. But on top of that, I mean, there's other mechanics that are happening here. There's baited AoEs, there's marks on players. The boss gets stronger repeatedly if it kills people, especially in short succession. Even post-nerf, that can be a bit of a problem. Heck, if somebody disconnects, the boss gets a damage stack, which is just hilarious. But then on top of that, the arena also opens up the whole thing, and these giant iron balls start just rolling all over the place, and you got to make sure they don't crush you while you're, again, baiting AoEs and also killing a heart that is being sent to the boss by a cat. You have to look for a cat, listen to it meow, and kill the heart that it tries to give to the boss, because it's a massive buff of all those damage stacks. So Again, really engaging, really good use of the arena. And while it does repeat things maybe a little too much compared to some of the other fights, it's a constant on-edge situation when the boss is just constantly pulling and dragging and summoning adds and doing all this other stuff that can really disorient the party. And number 4 on the list, we're going to hop away from Midas and back up to the creator for that of A12S, the final boss in the Alexander raid series, Alexander Prime. You know, it says a lot for the other 3 fights above this when the final boss of the raid series is only number 4, especially given that this is a really good fight. Alexander hits like a damn truck, has a fast and furious adds phase, and does a phenomenal job of splitting up the party and making them do different things across different points of the fight, whether it be positions for things like time stops or sending people through time gates. That time gate mechanic is forever going to be one of the most praised mechanics across all of Final Fantasy XIV because it fits the fight so thematically and visually. I mean, think about this. You're fighting Alexander inside of Alexander, who summons a giant Alexander and then sends you back in time so you can save yourself from another Alexander. It's mind-blowing, and it's all that is told to you just through the mechanics, and it's done incredibly well. On top of that, they have some minorly cryptic stuff that's really satisfying to solve, like the crystals that spawn that'll reveal where Alexander is when he like time warps into different locations. The only downside, the only one to this fight, is that it was not tuned tightly enough. So you skip a lot of the final phase, even in the early weeks, even without a lot of gear. It's such a good phase too. There's like puddles that need to be absorbed. Most people will call them wormholes because of the Epic of Alexander. But then you also need to like bait these puddles on the ground that are following players at the same time the boss is doing Sacrament, and at the same time you're doing those large wormholes. Then there's extra tank busters. There's really hard hitting raid wides. There's so many things that happen so quickly, and it's such a huge amount of damage and movement and placement and responsibility. And it can all go downhill so quick, but it just wasn't tuned tightly enough. People used to just be okay with those big puddles failing because they didn't have a player inside of them. And you could just kind of limp your way through the end, even if you did screw up. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's what the world first kill even looked like. So it's unfortunately not a great end to the fight, but objectively, all of those mechanics are fantastic. I just wish we could get something that's scaled more properly and get it re-released in the modern day. I think it'd be pretty cool. Now for number 3, we're going to go down a fight back to A11S. And honestly, I was kind of going forward and back between this and A12S in terms of 3 and 4 because of this fight actually has a number of issues, A11. It has an entirely skippable phase, and there are attacks that you just may never see if your DPS is okay, and then it becomes embarrassing if you see them because that means your DPS is really not okay. That being said, what transpires in the rest of the encounter is a fun, straightforward battle that's given us some iconic mechanics we still see to this day. Cruise Chaser itself uses a few basic attacks. You know, it's got spreads, it's got baited AoEs, rotating AoEs, simple stuff. But he also has a ton of stuff that kind of marvels in its simplicity. Stuff like left and right swords for players to dodge. You just got to read the name of the ability and step to the correct side. And then there's like these mini DPS checks where he summons an ad, and then the ad summons an ad that you need to kill before its cast finishes, 1 or 2 GCDs. And then the ad itself will become enraged and you hit the tank a lot harder. Try to do like a tank buster. It'll hit them once and then you have to dodge the other hits, all while other things are happening. So these mini DPS checks inside mini DPS checks while you're dealing with the boss mechanics is a lot of fun. There's also like fire on the ground, and then the boss will reduce your max HP to 1. So you need to make sure you have shielding so you can properly save these people in time. And then shields that can only be DPS from one side of the boss, and then a spread charge. So as soon as you destroy that shield, you got to make sure you're spread properly. But honestly, the most iconic thing, the thing most people expect me to talk about, is Limit Cut. This attack swipes at players from behind before charging to another player, and it does that numerically. So it'll swipe at 1, charge at 2, swipe at 3, charge at 4, and go through all of those numbers. It's so simple, but there's really tight positioning. You have to remember your numbers, get into the right spot, check the direction you're facing. It's just become such a feared mechanic, especially if it's ever made to be done with other things at the same time. As soon as we do any fight, we see those little numbers pop up over our heads. Ooh, there's always some degree of concern. This fight just kind of had that effect on players. Not to mention, there's a little active time event, which is just a nice little short break. It's not anything too engaging, but it gives the players kind of like a second to catch their breath. The skippable Lapis phase, if you don't skip it, is actually a really well done ad phase. And the careful act of saving pieces of the arena in the final bit, the fact that it doesn't necessarily have a hard enrage, but you need to be able to keep the arena itself propped up by saving pieces of it, which forces you to place mechanics in certain ways, and there are certain mechanics the boss has that will undoubtedly damage them. So you have to weigh when you want to deliberately damage them to make a mechanic easier versus when you want to limit the amount of damage they take so you can preserve the encounter longer. There's just a lot of little things like that that do really, really well. And it's nice to have that because Cruise Chaser is kind of an iconic boss. It's originally a reference to like a late 1980s game, Cruise Chaser Blasty, which is why you see Blasty, all over this boss whenever he talks. But also, Final Fantasy IX's Arc is a reference to Cruise Chaser Blasty, so this becomes a reference to both of them with the Final Fantasy IX animation somewhat making an appearance here as well. But at the same time, Cruise Chaser itself has become iconic to Final Fantasy XIV, so it doesn't just feel like an homage anymore. It feels very much like its own original memorable thing. Number 2 on the list. Now, there's only 2 encounters left, so I'm sure people are trying to figure out which of the 2 is there. If you watch my top 5 raid series, you probably know what the answer should be, but I'm going to surprise people. And my number 2 is A3S, Living Liquid. Talk about that again in a little bit, why it's number 2. Is it pain, really, that puts me here, though? Because this boss is one of the ones I have the most different experience with compared to most people watching this video. It's one of the most historic encounters in Final Fantasy XIV history. The Slayer of Statics, the Jiggly Butt, the Hands of Pain. This encounter broke the souls and spirits of most raiders in early Heaven's Ward, sporting really tight DPS checks, insanely tight mechanical checks, and just pushing every element of player skill at the time to its absolute limit. Whether it be passing Digititis debuff and passing it after a random knockback to boot, bursting DPS on the hands to level them out during Hand of Pain, while they crush the tanks full of damage, who, by the way, at this point, were turning off tank stance just to meet DPS checks, so they were taking even more damage back then because that's how it worked. You have crowd-controlled ads during the very masterfully done ad phase, and those unresponsive tank tethers. Oh, the worst. So many jokes about that. So many places things can go wrong everywhere across all phases, and it never stops until the very end. Especially magnets. People don't know how magnets work. It's depressing. And anyway, getting back onto this, reliving my trauma at this point. If there's a single fight you want to blame for healers being expected to DPS in Final Fantasy XIV for the way that tanks would just like forego their most natural tank stance and had to have that completely reworked, it's this encounter. It happened a little bit outside of this beforehand, but this encounter pushed it to that level. It just changed the game in ways that a lot of people will never know or understand, and it still holds a special, if not damaged, place in a lot of people's hearts. That being said, it's unfortunate that you can never relive that experience because they nerfed the ever-loving hell out of this encounter. It's just, you have to self-impose restrictions to even come close to emulating the way it was back then, and it's not the same. And honestly, I don't even wish that upon most people because I was there on the front lines. I was one of only 6 groups to beat it before tombstone weapons became available, and I wouldn't wish that upon anyone. But at the same time, experiencing history is kind of nice. And the first phase of T doesn't even come close to replicating everything this fight does. And finally, my number 1, A8S, the final boss of Midas. Like I said, this might be a bit of a surprise. A8S did not even show up in my top 5 boss ranking video for Final Fantasy XIV, but A3S did. For this video, though, I considered what the objective was of the video. And I think for me, I needed to think of what the overall better fight was and less of a top 5 of my favorite. I at least wanted to consider that more here because I think if you just look at A8S against the rest of the encounters, it does a lot of the things A3S does, but it's more creative and a little bit more fun of a boss. I mean, that's from the music to the appearance to the themes to kind of just the entire energy of the encounter. So as revenge for not making it into that video, A8S now sits at number 1 for this video. This encounter has almost no flaws. in its design, from start to finish. Every phase is a piece of a larger puzzle, draws from past mechanics and experiences, and just makes for a really, really good encounter. It starts with a slightly more mobile version of the manipulator. It's a manipulator wannabe, it's not called that, but like it's meant to invoke that thought. It even has the same theme as manipulator and has some of the same mechanics as well. But again, it's drawn out to be a little bit more interesting and to use the arena space a lot better. And and the boss can actually be moved. But then on top of that, it then does like a gauntlet of bosses similar to A6S against the A6S robots. It summons 2 of them, and then a few seconds later summons the 3rd one, a few seconds later summons the 4th one, and you need to manage these things so quickly. You got to burst one down, you got to deal with this one's mechanics and that one's mechanics, and then when you reduce them to 50%, they each do like a special mechanic. So one of them has like a transition phase, one of them summons an ad that can't be next to the boss, so it summons like the clone from the blaster fight. So you need to separate the clone and blaster, but there's also another boss coming down. There's just all these elements, not to mention height during the whole thing, which of course always catches people off guard. And then they all combine into this giant robot called Brute Justice, and that's really when the fight begins. This trumpet kicks in, the fight goes extra crazy. Now, Brute Justice itself has some okay mechanics. You know, it's got a split damage missile, it's got spread missiles, it's got prey markers that need to be spread. It jumps around, it fires lasers, it fires flamethrowers, it does these rocket punches. It does a bunch of things that are, you know, neat and nifty. But what most people will remember are what we call the intermission phases, where it delinks all of the robots from the previous phases and does basically what is the equivalent of ultimate trios, but in a Savage level encounter. And it's to this day kind of regarded to as the first instance of an ultimate level mechanic. I mean, you just need to be doing so many things at once. Not to mention that it's also regularly regarded to as the first ultimate encounter because it has a Savage exclusive phase. About 3 minutes of the encounter where Brute Justice regains all its health, becomes Winged Justice, or we call it Winged Justice, and then has a whole new set of mechanics or mechanics from the earlier phases amped up to the nth degree. It has Gavel, Link Up, and of course the legendary J Waves, that final DPS and healing check at the very end of the fight. It's a masterpiece. Even if you were to do it nowadays, even if it weren't to be as difficult as it was back then, I think doing it really lets you appreciate what the fight is and can probably imagine what it was like to get that kind of encounter, you know, like 7 years ago at this point. And that's going to be a wrap for my Heavensward ranking video. I'm sure a lot of you notice how much more energy I have in this than the A Realm Reborn ones, and that's just kind of how it was. I'm very passionate about the Heavensward raid scene, even if I think the current raid scene would never survive it. I don't want it back, but at the very least, it's worth revisiting these memories and what they mean, because they all influenced the way the game is nowadays. Creator defined what Savage tiers would be for the future. It was the first tier we got that, hey, you can kind of treat this as a mid-core raid kind of Savage, whereas Gordius and Midas scared people away nonstop, especially with the other content that was coming out in between. It was a scary time for Final Fantasy XIV. But at the same time, you can laugh at our pain and realize that things are, for the most part, in a better place now. Anyway, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share. And stay tuned. We're doing a ton of nostalgic videos for A Realm Reborn's 10th anniversary. And, well, I just want you all to be along for the ride. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one. And until then, take care.